welcome everybody. I'm Shelley Burt, and I've had the pleasure of being on the Symposium Planning Committee, and it's just been such a terrific experience over the last few days to see the idea come to reality in such a vibrant way that it has. You have behind you the product of the painting art workshop, and Peter has told me to please remember to take your art at the end of the evening, to take it home, or maybe tomorrow, don't forget. Cell phones, please take the time now to turn them off. We're gathering together again in the large group to hear the keynote speeches, or the time for the four remaining of invited speakers to share with us their work and how it connects with the themes of this conference. I wanted to just say a few words in introduction and in maybe less my own response than what some thoughts that I've brought here around the idea of being human, and especially the second part of our title, Towards New Thinking. And the concept that I've worked with and that I wanted in my own writing have tried to bring forward as a new thought to work with as we think about being human and individuals with cognitive disabilities is the idea of robust inclusion. And inclusion we know very well. And in fact, in the United States, we may disagree about how well it's practiced, but it's certainly practiced. Inclusion is the watchword in a way for caring for children and adults with disabilities after they arrive in the world. But at the same time that we have the will and technology to practice inclusion, we have also important strands in our culture that would accept fewer and fewer people being born with the disabilities that we are then willing to include. So thinking about that challenge, also from within my own lived experience, having given birth to a child with Down syndrome, who is no longer with us, but I've come up with and I'm looking to connect with individuals who think of the idea of robust inclusion, and what would that mean? And my thought about this is robust inclusion would mean welcoming the conception, gestation, and birth of people with all sorts of disabilities. To welcome those who are now seen to fall outside the realm of what we might call normal or healthy. What would it take for us to be a society that valued and practiced robust inclusion? I'm just share with you 4 ideas that I've had, and this is very much just to share and invite response maybe as our conversations continue. One would be to find a different vocabulary, especially in the medical world, that did not pathologize genetic difference as it's uncovered and found for men and women beginning families. The second would be openness to expand our understanding of what is normal. The third would be willingness to be open to that which arrives in our experience and to challenge what is so valued in our society of controlling our destiny or experience. So we have changing the pathologizing, openness to expanding the understanding of normal, willingness to be open. And the fourth very big picture, of course, and I want to thank Sophia and Eva Kate especially for bringing this strongly into my own reflection, is that we need social, political, and economic structures that allow us to care for people of all range of needs and not experience that the care will be an overwhelming challenge. And Camp Hill is an example of a community that provides that type of structure. And for those of us who don't live in Camp Hill, it can sometimes be such an important reflection back to what the outside world doesn't offer. So those things may be very difficult to achieve. Right now, we may not even be able to see our way towards, could that all come to be over the next generation or generations. But for me, it's important to say that if those existed, we could be welcoming. We could be a robustly inclusive society. And so to the extent that we fall short, we really need to look inside and ask ourselves, are we satisfied with that? So thank you for letting me offer my own brief reflections before turning to the speakers for tonight. And I hope and expect we have all gotten to know our speakers through the different forms in which we've been offered to be in conversation with each other. So my introductions will be brief. The charge tonight, again, to the speakers was to share an aspect of their work that touched on the conference theme of being human in the 21st century towards new thinking, and perhaps, but I don't think required, to fold in some reflections and response to the activities and conversations of the last few days. So our first speaker will be Sophia Wong, and it's a special pleasure for me to welcome Sophia, who's a friend of mine, and who really stood out as an individual engaged. Well, I wanted to say, Eva and Sophia have presented themselves as humbler philosophers, but in fact they're actually philosophers with a great deal of courage, because to take on the task of writing about and reflecting philosophically about the question of moral personhood of people with disabilities, you have to be courageous in the academy today. And Sophia has done that and brings work of great value to us from her role as a professor. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Camp Hill, for inviting me to celebrate your 50th birthday. And this is a wonderful opportunity for me to try something new. So as Shelley said, she asked me whether I wanted to go first at the beginning of the symposium or last, so that I could reflect on what I had heard. So I said, well, I think I'll see what it is first and then offer some reflections. But I haven't had very much time, so forgive me if this is just a few pictures with a few thoughts. I decided to write a letter to the citizens of the 22nd century, 100 years from now, and to think of these remarks as a type of time capsule. Probably most of us won't be there, but maybe they will discover this time capsule and they will have a picture of what it meant to be human, at least from Sophia Wong at this time. So, dear citizens of the 22nd century, I have put together this time capsule so that you can understand what it meant for some of your ancestors to be human in the 21st century. I'll start by telling you a little bit about my story, and then I'll tell you a little bit about a place called Camp Hill. And I'm thanking Eugene, my roadie, who will advance to the next slideshow in the old-fashioned, just the next one there. And I don't know if I should make a little beep, like the old, some of you remember that in school. Okay, so this is my family. My parents were immigrants who became Canadian citizens in the 1960s. My mother was a violinist from Japan, or she still is a violinist, and my father was an accountant from Hong Kong. When my brother, Leo, was born, the doctors advised my parents to put him in an institution. But they said no, thank you. They decided to raise him at home with me. So my grandmother moved from Hong Kong to live with us and to help us. Beep. This is a picture of me and my brother from the 1970s. My brother has always loved to look and to listen carefully. So today he's a painter and a musician. And I have always loved to ask questions about the world. So I decided to study philosophy. Beep. Skipping several years, this is now 2006, and this is the painting that my brother made to celebrate me getting my PhD in philosophy. And at this point, I want to acknowledge that Eva Kitay's book, Love's Labor, which is an excellent book you may like to read, is the book that inspired me to write about disabilities and the impact in my life. And I remember the moment that I found her book and read it, and I said to myself, wow, philosophers can do this? That's great, then that's what I want to do. So I'm very delighted to be appearing at the same symposium with Eva. Beep. So what do philosophers do? And that's something that we haven't really talked about, so I thought I would try to sum up at least 3 things that we try to do. So the first thing we look for is we try to reveal the hidden assumptions behind what people say and believe. Because many times in the media, people just say things, but they don't explain what's behind that or what's underneath that. The second thing we like to do is we ask whether current social practices are in harmony with the core values of our society. And of course, that means figuring out what are our core values. And there may be a lot of disagreement. But as Eva Kitay mentioned in some of the group conversation yesterday, we may find an overlapping consensus of what our values are. So then ask whether what the things we're doing are really in line with what we believe. And thirdly, and this is something that Rudolf Steiner did very well, is to challenge existing systems by imagining new ways of structuring human societies. So these are the 3 things that we do, and to the extent that any of you do these 3 things, you also are doing philosophy. And as my brother Leo would say, it has nothing to do with dental floss. That's philosophy. Now, originally on my MacBook computer, this slide had all kinds of colors, but now we have converted to the PC, so it's in black and white. And you're not meant to be able to read those things on the right-hand side. This is just to give you an idea of the structure of my research. So as you can see, I have 4 main questions. To right around Passover, my 4 questions. And the first one is the idea of duties of justice to citizens with cognitive disabilities. And so I asked the question, what do social contracts theorists assume about the nature of human beings? So very briefly, social contract theory is a long tradition in Anglo-American European philosophy in which people ask, if we were to all get together in a room and negotiate about what kind of rules we wanted to establish for our society, what would we be able to agree on? And who would be in the room with us negotiating, and who would we be thinking about? And so when you take this type of approach to think about what justice consists in, you have to make assumptions about the nature of human beings. So what I found in my research is that these social contract theorists assume that some, but not all human beings are moral persons. And we heard about this a little bit on Tuesday evening. So I would ask to those social contract theorists to look at the next slide with us and ask, which of these people has a sense of justice and a conception of the good life? Because those are the 2 things that a philosopher named John Rawls has said that consists in being a moral person. So it's sense of justice, knowing what's fair and what's not, and being willing to play by the same rules as you impose on everyone else. Now, I know my brother doesn't like to play by the same rules as everyone else, but also a lot of non-disabled people don't want to play by the same rules as everyone else. So I'm not sure if anyone I know really has a sense of justice in a very strong sense. But perhaps in a weak sense, many of us do. And then what does it mean to say that every human being or every moral person, has to have a conception of the good? Does that just mean knowing what you want to have for lunch today? Because most of us know that, some of us don't. Or does it mean having a whole life plan and knowing exactly where you want to go and what you want to do? Because I don't have that mapped out yet, and I don't know about you. So those are the kind of questions we look at in that project. My answer for now is what I call my working hypothesis, which is on the next slide. I say that I think the concept of the human being, which is assumed by social contract theory, is too narrow. It doesn't capture the richness and the variety of human experience. And I don't have proof for this. The only proof is that I've lived on this earth for 40 years, and I've had many experiences that cannot be captured by the language of political theory using the social contract. So we'll just leave that there for now as a working hypothesis. Let's go to the next question, which should be in blue. There it is. So my next project is ongoing. Ever since I started teaching philosophy, I taught for high school students, for middle school students over one summer, and then I went into teaching university students. And I wanted to imagine a place where people of diverse abilities and cultural backgrounds meet to practice philosophy together. Now, what would this place look like? And I'm really happy to say that we are in such a place right now. We're thinking about philosophical questions together. So if we go to the next slide, we'll see some pictures. And I don't know how well you can see them, but on the top left, we have some people in a park in Brooklyn, and they're participating in something called the Urban Mandala Project. This means taking things that are recycled items and putting them together in a pattern, a circular pattern to make a mandala that they then disassemble and take pieces of it home and then do more art projects with that. Are they learning something about philosophy by making the mandala? I don't know. The second picture to the right, on the top right, is actually from the conference that Eva Kiteo organized. That's the typical academic conference of people sitting in chairs with beards, listening to a speaker. All right. Then we see a child who's drawing on the wall. Then we see my classroom in which I have the students come and meet with me individually. And then we see some children playing the piano and experimenting. So I'm just asking the question. I don't know whether philosophy can be learned in all of these situations or none of them, but this is something that I'm exploring through my teaching. So my answer for now is that if we use the concept of universal design, we can help people learn philosophical concepts through the arts, through music, through drama, improvisation, interviewing, and conversing, talking, as well as reading and writing. And I suppose today, after yesterday's workshop, I have to say also through clowning as well. Okay? Now, the third project that I have is slightly different, and it's something that I started during my sabbatical, and this is the Silence Project. And I'm asking the question, how can busy urban dwellers, like myself and my friends, how can we nurture the seeds of silent moments and quiet spaces in secular life? And this has been an ongoing project as well. And I'll just go to the next slide and show you one of the pictures that I took. Now, I want to stop here and be mindful of Veronica Römer's warning that a picture of the beach is not the same thing. This does not give you the experience of going to the beach, picking up those seashells and placing them around a natural type of mandala that I found. If you look carefully, I don't know if you can see, but the wind has blown the grass so that it drew a circle around itself. And so when I saw that, I thought, well, let me just add a few seashells. And I did all of this without speaking. However, even though this photo does not represent the reality of being there, I like to write about my experiments with silence, and I like to post small, low-resolution photos on the web so that my friends can be inspired, and I invite them to join me in finding beauty in the city or outside the city, but wherever they can find it. So I am inviting you all to visit my blog. It is not available on Google. You won't find it by Googling. So if you write down this address, my policy of my blog is that I share it with people that I have met in person. So even though I haven't really met all of you, I will invite you as Camp Pillars to join me in this journey. Okay. So I tried to write down the answer for the Silence Project question, and you'll see my answer on the next slide. Do you want to sit down so you can see the slides?
I was kind of looking over your shoulder.
Yeah, why don't you sit?
Well, I want to see what the answer is.
Yeah, you can sit down. Okay, so the next and final project that I'm working on now is on the next slide, and it is called Children as Non-Voluntary Caregivers in the Home. And it's the most risky work that I've done so far because it comes out of some personal experience, talking to people also. But my question is that if children become what I call assistant parents before they are mature, how does this harmonize with our concept of childhood as a time of play and creative growth? And so if we go to the next slide, we'll see that I have found some data showing that there are some very young children who routinely perform heavy caregiving tasks at home. Sometimes it's for their older siblings, sometimes it's for their parents with mental illness, sometimes it's for their grandparents, and often they are taking care of people who are physically larger and stronger than them. And sometimes they give injections, sometimes they administer or supervise psychiatric medications. Sometimes children are inserting and removing IV tubes at home. Sometimes they find themselves spending a lot of time with violent family members who may cause physical or emotional harm to them. I've spoken to siblings who have said that a person assaulted them sexually at home, but when they told their parents refused to believe it, so they had to continue to accept this abuse. And many children, former children, I suppose, that I spoke to are put in sole charge of their other siblings while their adult parents go away overnight or longer. And finally, something that I learned in my teaching is that many of my students who speak English as a second language have to do medical or legal translating for their parents or grandparents at doctor's appointments or in court. And they're doing this while they're still going to school, so they have to miss school to do these things. So I don't have an answer for this question yet, but I did want to show you the next slide, which includes some resources for siblings. And I know that I had spoken individually with some of you, and I don't remember who, so I wanted to put this on the slide. If you know of anyone who is a sibling of a person with a disability, please ask them to visit the Sibling Support project. That can be Googled. And we also have various listservs for people to talk, including parents who want to talk about their other typical developing kids. And then finally, there's a new leadership network called the Sibling Leadership Network, in which siblings are now stepping up and saying that we want to have more of a voice in family planning the futures of our siblings who are vulnerable. So that's kind of an ongoing project that I'm doing right now. So my answer for now is on the next slide to the question about children. And I say that when the basic structure of our society provides a variety of affordable and accessible support services for families, then parents will no longer have to rely on their children to provide the non-voluntary care for the vulnerable members of their families. And so, of course, the really important question is, how do we create that structure for our society? And that leads me to present to the 22nd century citizens some of my insights from the conversations I've had at Camp Hill over the last few days. So the next slide is, oh dear. Well, just ignore those squares there. First of all, we know that human beings learn through the arts. And I wanted to emphasize the basic rules of clowning that I learned yesterday, because I think these are very good moral precepts as well as rules of thumb for clowning, right? First of all, everyone should take care of their own needs before they look after others. Don't hurt people. Don't destroy objects or the earth. If people get hurt, stop clowning and take care of them. And so thank you to Angie Foster and Laura Galen who taught me these yesterday. Another insight on the next slide comes from my new friend Chris, who said, when we were talking about the 21st century and the last century, he said, there is only one century. Yes, and that can mean a lot of different things, but it's definitely something that I will take with me and think about that. What could that mean? Okay? The next one is on the next slide. A radically different way of structuring society means that everyone can share in caring for each other. That's something that I've seen in action here. And when I was talking to Annie, she said, I want my brother to move to a Camp Hill village near me. She said, not the same one, but one nearby. And I said, why? And she said, because I want him to dip his toe into something he's never tried before. And I thought that this was just a wonderful place to stop and to say that, you know, during the next century, we'll be trying a lot of things we've never tried before. So the next slide is one of my mosaics. It's a lighthouse. And dear citizens of the 22nd century, we hope that we will have taken good care of the earth and of each other. If we have made mistakes, please forgive us. We had no lighthouse to warn us of dangers lying ahead. All we could do was take some risks and make mistakes together. Sometimes we hurt each other, and sometimes we hurt the earth, but we always did try to do the best we could. After all, we are only human. So the next slide is the last one, a mandala that I made in Brooklyn, and my email if you'd like to contact me. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Tom Stearns, who has come to us from the same community village in Vermont of Heartbeat. Tom is a gardener who has turned his hobby into a business and turned his business into a way of building community. And Tom, I think you're going to speak a little bit about that tonight.
Sure. Thank you. All right, you can start those. Those are just going to roll through, so you'll see all of them more than once. It's great to be here. I'm going to give you just a little bit of background on me so you know where I'm coming from, and then launch right into the work that I get to do that I feel very lucky about, and share that with you a little bit. I may have mentioned this earlier during some of the other talks, but I discovered when I was getting my degree in sustainable agriculture in Prescott College in Arizona that my father had grown up on one of the first early organic and biodynamic farms in the United States, which was in Southern California. He went to a farm school there that was run by Mr. Barton, who was a theosophist and a deep follower of Madame Blavatsky. And there already began in the early 30s to be some influence of biodynamic agriculture, of course, since the agricultural lectures were in 1924, I believe. And so here I was 20 years into my life studying agriculture, finding that my dad and my own upbringing as a gardener growing up had this really interesting connection. My very first teachers for farming were biodynamic farmers. So that's part of the background that I bring here. I fell in love with seeds. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about seeds, but seeds have led me down quite an interesting path. And so that's more of what I'm going to share with you. In some ways, I feel like I come from the future. So I guess people are going to look like this in the future, maybe. Maybe not such a good future. Who knows? This is the only time I'm going to say Steiner said also. So if you're waiting for it later, this is only once. Steiner said that there are people in each moment of time that are ahead of where the rest of people are. They are leading us, and usually nobody likes them at all. They usually get hung or ostracized. I mean, you can see this through history so long. I think there are also places like that, not just people like that. And perhaps this is a place like that is part of the future. I think that the community that I come from and where Hannah and Jonathan and Annie and Chris and Heartbeat is from and Sarah that are here is also a place that is ahead of where many, many other places are in this country. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about it and why I think that's important and what indications it might give for us. 10,000 years ago, the dawn of agriculture began, and we began saving seeds, domesticating plants and animals, and we began the first food system, essentially. Of course, it was very instinctive back then. There was no plan. There was no strategy. It was just how things began. And over centuries and centuries and millennia, we began to do things quite differently. Starting even as much as 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, we started to move food around a lot. What do you think the first kinds of food were that were moved from one place to another, transported hundreds or more miles? Spices, definitely. Any other ideas? Not grains, sugar. Chocolate. Okay, so these fall into two categories. You've got salt, sugar, and spices. These are the accents of our meal. They are not the core of the meal. You didn't put salt on top of your meal even 50 or 100 years ago. It's because your meal was usually so darn salty already that you didn't need to. The salt was used to preserve the meats, the vegetables that we grew during the growing season, whether it was the warm time or the wet time or wherever it happened to be. And spices similarly were used that way, and so was sugar. And then, of course, chocolate and tobacco and coffee. Those were the three other things that began to get moved around, and they were more luxury items. And I, for one, am glad that at least two of those are perhaps not as much luxury items anymore, but are part of our life. So moving food around is not new. But how we do it now and how we have interacted with this earth through growing food now is something that has gotten us into quite a mess, actually. We've really messed up for the last 300 years. And that's okay, because part of what being human means, no matter what century it means failing miserably at things and picking yourself back up and figuring out how to do it again and do it differently. And that's a very common human trait, and it's one that I'm sure will be with us long, long into the future. When we think about the challenges that we face today as a planet, again, why don't you call out a couple of the challenges you feel that we're facing as a planet? Overpopulation. Global warming, climate change. Water, resource scarcity. Sure, there's health. All these things we talked about earlier today, technology, things like that, violence, money. When you draw all the way back, following the thread of each of those, you come to a common source, I believe. I admit to having pretty serious blinders on and have a very focused attention that the food system and how we grow, transport, move, process food is actually the cause of almost all of the problems we face today. The biggest user of energy on this entire planet is the food system. The biggest polluter of water and soil and air is the food system. The biggest contributor to climate change is our food system. And health. Remember the time, and you all remember it well, and hopefully you still live it mostly, but remember the time when what we ate used to be what contributed to our health and built our health? The Centers for Disease Control, less than a year ago, came out with a study that estimated that 70% of the people in the United States today are going to die from a diet-related illness. 70% is an awful big number. And that means heart disease, diabetes, things like that, not so much E. coli. I promise I'm going to bring you all back up when I'm done with the depressing first few minutes. Okay? Because there's a lot of really good news, and that's mostly what I'm going to talk about. But here's where we're at. Here is this crazy place we've come to. We have this beautiful planet that, as far as we know, is unlike anything else out there. It is precious. Yet, the major way that we interact with this planet is actually contributing to its demise. And we aren't even getting anything good out of it. I mean, if we were actually building our health out of that, then maybe there'd be a trade-off or some sort of a balance you need to put in there. But it's not only killing the planet, but it's doing that to us too. So here we've come to this food system that we have now. And the 21st century absolutely needs a new food system. We need a new way of growing food, a new way of thinking about food, and thinking about all of the aspects of how we grow, process, and move food from one place to another. Most of you probably get to benefit from eating food that is fresh and close to home and celebrating the seasons. But you may also know that in a grocery store, probably just within a few miles of here, there are ripe tomatoes and ripe strawberries. So the thing is that now that we've become so used to food being all things available anywhere, all the time, no matter what the season is, the problem with it is that it tastes like garbage all of the time, no matter where it comes from, no matter what the season. And the crazy problem is that the grocery stores are so used to that big truck coming to deliver the strawberries that even when strawberries are ripe here in like 6 weeks or something like that, maybe 2 months, they're not getting them from here. So even when they are in season here, they still don't taste good. Of course, you have farmers markets in your own strawberry patch probably and all of that, but not everybody gets to benefit from that. And there are many children who think that a strawberry is supposed to be white inside. And they're not, in case anybody knows. Red, juicy, dripping is what a strawberry is supposed to be like. And there are a lot of people who don't know that. Some of you may have had this experience where you bite into a tomato or you have some food when it's really perfect and the thought you have is, I must not have ever had a real tomato before. Like, you have just tasted the tomato. What have you been eating the rest of your life? And how can you go back to that once you've really tasted it? The reality that we face today is that most of this country does not know what a real tomato tastes like, which means they don't know what they're missing. And they also don't know, although more and more are learning, what it takes for them to get a bad-tasting tomato. So not only is it not good, but again, what it stands behind that bad-tasting tomato is a whole lot of destruction along the way. So what is the point, is my question. What is the point of that? So this new food system that many people are beginning to think about and become aware of, every time there's an E. coli or a salmonella scare out there, every time oil prices jump really high, anytime food prices jump high, there are millions of people across this country, groups just like us, whose consciousness begins to shift. And I swear to you that I feel it. When I hear on the news about an E. coli scare, I walk outside on my porch and I sit really still. And I try to feel a million people's consciousness shift like that. And they're thinking there is something not right about this. I was in Holland with a friend who sells spinach seed. And he sells millions and millions and millions of dollars of spinach seed in an area of this country that produces most of the spinach for the entire United States. It's an area of about 3 counties in California. And the spinach E. coli scare happened, and there were some people who got sick from spinach, and all of the farmers in those counties plowed in their spinach fields. The acres of spinach there are unlike anything probably most of you have ever seen. There's more acres of spinach in those 3 counties than there are acres of vegetables in the entire Northeast. We are talking about tens and tens and tens of thousands of acres of spinach. So his business dried up and disappeared. And he was listening to a phone call telling him this. And it was in 10 minutes, he basically saw the whole thing evaporate. Then I got a phone call, and I was glad I had my little piece of technology in my pocket to get this. Without that, I would not be here to tell you this story. The phone call that I got was from a friend of mine who grows spinach, and he was at the Montpelier, Vermont Farmers Market. And he said, "Tom, you will not believe what is going on. There is a line around the block of customers wanting my spinach." So here you had, and they said these are not familiar faces. These are new people. They are not customers that I've seen before. You had those people shift immediately, instinctively, towards something that they knew more directly and that they trusted more directly. Taste didn't lead them there. Perhaps fear, in some ways, led them there, but also a certain amount of trust and hope led them there. And that is happening to millions of people. But here's the trouble. Most of those folks don't have the benefits that we all have of having farmers markets near us or a CSA right down the road, half a mile away, quarter mile away. Most of those folks don't have schools that have local food and fresh food and organic food in the schools. So when their consciousness begins to shift for whatever reason, they don't actually have too many practical examples to look at. They're beginning to realize that this food system is systemically broken. And what they see are a scattershot of examples of a few healthy things happening. Something different is happening, but it's something over here, and 50 miles later, there's something over there. There are very few examples of a systemically healthy food system anywhere. And I think that is part of the reason why there have been so many people's eyes on our little town in Vermont and in our region there. We've had visitors from more than 80 countries last year alone. We've had almost 10 different movies made about what's happening in our region. And I'll tell you a few of those stories, but I just wanted to give you that context of what's going on in our area and the context in which I look at it, and I think that a lot of us up there look at it. We are on the leading edge of how to address and very concretely fix the major aspects of how we interact with this earth and contribute to its health or non-health, and the major way that we build our own physical health through the food that we eat, and of course, the flavor that we can all strive for, that we know it can have again, and the camaraderie around sharing it. That's a pretty big task. So, here's a few of these stories now. About 5 years ago, we began to, a group of us began to get together. Hannah has been in that group. And it was business owners in food and agriculture, and also nonprofit leaders involved in food and agriculture, right in our immediate region. There's a few outliers, but right in our immediate region. And we began meeting once a month at a different person's place. So we would have a wonderful potluck, and we, of course, needed to make sure that we had good ingredients for this potluck, but everybody was involved in farming and agriculture, so it was really good, except that we were missing chocolate. So we invited a friend of ours who runs a chocolatier, and now she comes and brings truffles, as well as herself. It wasn't just for that. Once a month we've been getting together. We have a potluck, we have a tour of one of our places, and we have a discussion on a topic that is really critical and really hot for one of us right now. It may be anything from the boring, perhaps, some minutia of cash flow in our business. It may be about work-life balance. It may be about how to create, how to make our mission, the mission that we have in our business, more alive. So ranging on all those things. And there's about 20 or 25 of us that have been getting together for 5 years now. It's about 4 hours each time that we do this. That's a lot of hours together in a pretty small region. And that has allowed pretty incredible camaraderie and networking to be built and to grow. and has been unlike anything that I have ever been a part of before. These businesses and farms and community leaders are all growing and expanding what they do very, very quickly. Heartbeat is an example of that. 3 houses, 1 more on the way next spring, and a couple more in the plans for the future. Our business, High Mowing Seeds, has been growing very, very rapidly. It's basically been all we can do to keep up with it. And many of the other farms in the area as well. There are more organic farms per capita in the Hardwick region than anywhere else on the planet. So it is quite a hot spot. And the town has gone through a very interesting transformation in the last 5 years, and it's a longer history that I'm not going to get into so much, but it is very interesting to think about the biography of a place, not just a person. You think about it sometimes as the biography of an organization like Camp Hill, but I like to think of it too as the biography of a place. What is its history? What are those soils? What's the weather? What are the demographics? Those are all really valuable pieces that allow certain things to emerge in some places and not in others. Or fertile ground for some things, perhaps not as fertile ground for other things. A few pieces of this story that I want to tell you about. I think that how we use money in the 21st century needs to drastically change. I think a lot of how we got into this various mess that we're in now, whether it's just the financial mess or whether it's this expanded mess, is how money works. It is not money itself. It's just how we've used money. Money is meant to move, in my opinion. It is meant to circulate and move and be alive. Otherwise, if it stays still, if it gets hoarded, then you develop a certain amount of greed, of course, but also you don't allow anything to happen if that money is, when that money is moving. It basically can be a generative force if it's moving, and it can be a very stagnating force if it stays still. There are many, many farms, businesses, small organizations around this country and around this world that are tied into the traditional banking system that we have. There are also many foundations around this world, around this country, and even here, that probably don't invest their money consistent with their beliefs. They maybe give grants out consistent with their beliefs, but then they invest their money sometimes in exact opposite areas of what they're granting to. I know numerous grant-making organizations that give grants for sustainable agriculture that actually own shares in Monsanto. And they're making money, they're profiting from that. And they're struggling with this. You might imagine they'd be struggling with it. Where do we invest our money? How does this work? And perhaps there's an alternative stock market. There's many different ideas out there. But one of the things I wanted to tell you about that's really simple and been wonderful in our area is that one of these monthly meetings, somebody was talking about how this time of year is always really hard for them because they run out of money in their business. It's like an annual cycle they have, just like a farmer who in the spring needs more money for the seeds, for hiring people, for compost, for all sorts of spring activities. And of course, it's, the fall is when farmers are wealthier with the full bounty of harvest. So in our group, we discovered there was somebody else's business, who had a very different cash flow cycle that complemented this first person's need. This is very simple. The time when I'm fat is the time when you are lean. So they matched up, and we witnessed $50,000 getting written in a check right then and there to this other business. There's no agreement or anything like that. This was based on the trust and camaraderie that we have with each other, that we have here. But because it was businesses, it was a little bit higher dollar amount. Like, I don't have 50 grand to lend to a buddy of mine, but perhaps my business has 50 grand to lend to a buddy of mine's business, or a nonprofit, or whatever it might be. We were blown away. Those of us in the group were blown away by the risk that was taken in that moment. There's been over $1 million lent back and forth now in that group. That is money that would otherwise be stagnant that is moving, that is outside of the banking system, that is building wealth for each other, keeping it in the family, as it were. And so there is a number of innovative financial examples of what's happening in our region, and that is just one, but there are many, many more. The last thing that I want to address is innovation. And another thing that has occurred in our area is that young people are moving back. Just to kind of put it out to you, Hardwick is a town of 3,000 people, and it's got among the higher unemployment rates and the lower per capita income rates of anywhere in the state. And young people have left for a long, long time. But now they're moving back. Rural America has tried to figure out how to get young people to move back into it for concerted effort for 30 years. Tom Vilsack, who is the Secretary of Agriculture for the United States right now, he used to be the governor of Iowa, and he had a campaign to try to do this. And it was called Come Back to Iowa, Please. And what they would do is they would forgive $10,000 of your college loans or anything like that per year that you moved back and stayed, up to 10 years. Didn't work. They raised it to $20,000. And it still didn't work, or at least not that well. I'm sure there's an Iowan, if I tell this story at some point, that is going to raise their hand. But, and then they gave up on it. So, of course, the reason why they wanted young people to move back is that there is this youthful energy, innovative energy, progressive energy, young people. It's not just the economic activity of starting a family and buying a house. It is the energy that young people have to create new things, to solve the challenges we have today. So a rural area that is beginning to attract young people back into it is something that is another reason why many people have been coming to visit our region to figure out what we're doing that other people can replicate and do as well. The loss of young people from rural America is so extreme that in North Dakota, there are at least 10 zip codes that get wiped off the map every year. You know you're bad when you lose your zip code. And you know what that means is that there is not enough money in the tax base or enough people to support a post office. The children, when they close that school down, get bused sometimes hours to another rural school that is also struggling and has all of the smaller towns looking to it to figure out how to have its kids there. So I have heard so many stories like that. And when I've gone to these different communities, when they've asked me to come and share what's going on in our region, it is amazing to me how much hope exists for them just to know that a place like Hardwick is real and that it's possible. There are many people that are struggling with all sorts of things out there. Hope, and when they don't have hope, that is a pretty tough place to be. How can Camp Hill find a way to continue to encourage innovation and creativity from within, as well as allowing it to plug in from the outside? If I were to say the single most important and valuable thing that is happening in our area, it is deep, robust collaboration that leads to innovative, resilient solutions. The enthusiastic energy that comes from a situation like that is palpable. It attracts people, and it attracts the right kind of people in many ways, meaning it attracts people that are positive, gung-ho, ready to fully engage and be involved in something like that. And it also attracts a diversity of people, which is very wonderful because Vermont is not known as a very diverse place. So the question that I put out to you, and I don't have the answer, it's just the question, but I think it's the most important question that I can bring. When young people leave a place, that's an indication of a problem, in my opinion. When young people begin moving back to a place, that is something healthy is growing there. When innovation can find a home to thrive, to develop, and to grow out and start something new, that is very, very healthy for an organization, a town, a business, whatever it is. It needs to move, it can't be stagnant. And for a place like our town or Camp Hill or any tight community, it's very important, and it's been critical for us, to figure out how to create a welcoming and open structure for people to plug into from the outside. How do I find my way in? That is the question that many people have when they see something they're interested in. And if there is not a way in, there are many people that won't keep pushing and trying to get in. And maybe that filters out folks that aren't eager enough. And perhaps that does. But that's my question to Camp Hill as a movement. 50 more years you're going to have and beyond. And thinking about how, as a 50-year-old now, a youthful 50-year-old, you can look ahead to the changes, the progress, the innovation that is ahead for the next 50 years. You've got a great experiment that's been going for a long time. So keep it lively. Thanks.
Our third speaker for the evening is Judith Snow, who we all know already, has contributed from in our roundtables and other places. A social inventor and advocate for inclusion. I said I was so happy to see that word in your own write-up of your biography. Director of Laser Eagles, an organization dedicated to making creative activity available through personal assistance to artists with diverse ability. And Judith will be having an art exhibit opening this August at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto. So, Judith, welcome.
Thank you. And most of you have met Mike. This is Mike. And this is Mike. Words can be ambiguous. I want to begin in appreciation. So I would ask you to turn to your neighbor and just quickly express, in whatever way that works for you, something that you deeply appreciate. I do. A sense of humor. All right, hands up. Hands up if you can hear my voice. Hands up if you can hear my voice. Hands up. There you go. Hands up. Thank you. Thank you. I am in the presence of a few of my teachers. And trust me, nothing makes a person more humble and nervous than speaking in front of one's teachers. But I want to point out Manfred. Manfred, would you like to wave your hand? There he is. Sheep, 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 sheep. Right?
Long ago.
Long ago. And why Manfred is important to me, Judith, is because somewhere around 1983, he brought me to see Beaver Run. And that was out of a conference that we both had been at, where we were being pummeled with normalization. And I was there, I think, about 6 days. And around about day 5, the scales dropped from my eyes. And I realized that I was living with, playing with, celebrating with, and learning from people who in the real world, the regular world, the outside world, it depends on how you put it, who would be locked up, drugged out of their minds, in restraints, under electric shock, and otherwise considered to be, well, Peter Singer would have his day. And I was in the presence of a miracle. And I hope that you remember that every day. And I'm in the presence of Helen, who claims she can't hear me, but we all know that's not true. Who actually came to be in my home in Toronto in the 80s to talk about support circles and the intention and commitment that I have and had at that time to tell the story throughout the world of the power of support circles. A story that is not easy for people to tell because they are afraid that if they tell that story, somebody will take their power away. And I'll come back to that. And I'm in the presence of Bernard, who probably doesn't remember this, but I was sitting in Bernard's class one time when he was giving a lesson on the internal combustion engine. And one of his students is Billy, who's fascinated and adores BMWs. Do you remember Billy? He was amazing. And I got to see two people take on accomplishing something that neither one of them knew for sure could be accomplished. But they were willing to have a shot at it. And the amazing miracles that come out of that willingness to make it up as you go along and to take a shot at it. And Billy apparently went on to live in Kimberton Hills for a while and then moved on into the regular world somewhere, and apparently is doing just fine. So I have other identities. One One of them is that I'm a member of the faculty of the Asset-Based Community Development Institute that's based in Evanston. And that also started in the late 80s. And the idea of it is that every community has assets. And if we're willing to look at the assets of the community as opposed to the what's wrong with you here, that much power is given to us and much creativity is available to us. And there are basically 5 assets. One group of assets is what the individuals themselves carry. One is what they carry when they come together in caring circles, whether they care about knitting or seeds or whatever it might be, anthroposophy, right? In the presence of them caring about it together, they create many assets. And one set of assets is the organized ones. We often picture them as triangles, where there's the boss, and then the 2 sub-bosses, and the multitudes of minions. And if you draw a picture, it looks like a triangle. Well, we all have those assets as well, the churches, the businesses, the hospitals, and the government agencies. And one is, as Tom so beautifully talks about it, and others here too, is the earth itself. The location, the land, the earth, the place where we are. And the final asset wasn't added to the map until quite recently. And I think I might have had something to do with it. It's the asset of stories. Human beings are human because they tell each other stories. And we transmit our capacities to be human through our stories. And the question that we're struggling with is really, in my view, a question of, can we become more accountable for the stories we tell? Because people will know us through the stories we tell, and they will know what's possible through the stories that we tell. So just to give you a quick example, my entire life, my whole biography, is centered in the story of me remembering the day that my father was caring for me when I was about 6. And he told me that he had heard on the radio that doctors in California were killing children with Down syndrome. And they were doing that because those doctors felt that those children could not possibly grow up to a valued human existence, so they should be killed. And my father went on to say to me, in my day, so I was 6, and he's now 91, so that was 85 years ago. He said, in my day, in rural England, all we did was raise cows and grow potatoes. And if someone had Down syndrome, we probably wouldn't have even noticed. because people with Down syndrome can dig up potatoes and look after the cows like anybody else. So it made no difference to us. But you we would have killed, he said, because you would have no place in our economy. He didn't use exactly those words, but that's what he was saying. And so I asked him, why are you keeping me alive? And he said, maybe you'll find the answer. Now, from that moment on, I've been looking for answers. And I've been looking for better questions because I need to find better answers. That's who I am, right? And more recently, very recently, I realized that there was another part of that story which I think is relevant to us. That story is now about 100 years old. Actually, a little bit over 100 years old, if you look at it, because it's 85 years back to when my dad was 6. But in his context, you add another 25 or 35 years for all of his parents and neighbors and the cows and the sheep and all that. So the story is roughly 120 years old. So the length of my life is 120 years, although biologically I'm 61. Do you get that? You get what I'm saying? That's my story. Now, I've known people like Ivan Illich, who brought us a great deal of thinking about the issues of iatrogenesis in medicine and the dumbing down of education in the school system, and lots of books and stuff. His context started somewhere around 1200 AD. So his story is, what's that, 800, 900 years old. Got that? Now, if you look at somebody about Mike's age right now, his story can almost be told in nanoseconds. And we talked about that today, right? Because everything in life is all sped up and can happen more or less instantaneously. And that is the context that the newer people on the planet are more and more coming into. It's shortening very rapidly. So it might be 20 years, it might be 50 years, it might be a year long, depending on the individual, but it's very, very much shorter. Now, there's good news about that. The good news is you don't develop nearly as much baggage as you do if you're carrying around a 900-year-old context for yourself, or 120 years. But the bad news is you've got almost nothing to fall back on, to learn from, when you're trying to develop and give your context, your contribution, your destiny. But imagine if the people who are deeply tied to the land and to history were willing to give their stories freely when people who are free of baggage were needing a good story. What an incredible partnership is made possible, I believe. And speaking of partnership, I want to suggest to the Camp Hill people and to the anthroposophists, and many of you overlap, of course, I want to suggest that you tell a different story, at least some of the time. When I come into the Camp Hill context, the story I hear, it's a good story, it's a true story, but it's all about being refugees, struggling to survive, deciding to teach something called curative education to people who are labeled disabled, finding that as those people grew up, they had no place in the world. So opening villages to continue to live and share life with those people. And the nature of that story leaves something out, something very crucial. When I come into Camp Hill, typically I arrive late at night. I don't know why it is, or whatever community I end up coming into. And like we ended up driving around a bit this last time. And what's one of the first things I see? I see this brilliantly, wonderfully elaborate recycling system. And very early in the next day, I meet the man whose intention is so powerful that this whole beautiful recycling system was probably, I'll bet you anything, developed around his initiative to make sure that not even one little piece of paper was ever wasted at Kimberton Hills. And you know who I'm talking about, right? Yes? You do or you don't? Yes? You do? Okay, good. And so I want to connect. I want to contribute. I want to know this place and its assets so that I can be fully present and fully contribute while I'm here. So I say to Mike, you know, we have a lot of junk pieces of paper in the car, because my car's always full of junk, right? And these are old maps and whatever. Go bring them. He's right there. Bring the paper to him. And Mike, Judith's carrying on again, right? But eventually he does. And he gives the papers. Michael's his name, right? Yeah. So Michael. There's a lot of Mikes. A lot of Mikes and a lot of Veronicas around here. And he was in the transaction of giving the paper. Mike received this one, received the perfectly, deeply, awesomely given gift of appreciation and joy. Absolutely. Now, part of sustainability is appreciation and joy. And what I'm saying to you is some of the most important gifts in life, in what it means to be human, are invisible to the world that we live in. And if we do not speak those stories, they will not be seen. And you've heard these last few days exactly how invisible those gifts are. So the story that I want you to tell, and to tell it abundantly and freely and everywhere. Because, Stephen, I don't care how powerful Haramond and Lucifer are, they do not stand in the face of joy and appreciation. I want you, Campbell, to tell the story of the wonderful partnership that you created in the days when you had to run away. I want you to tell the wonderful stories of the partnerships where you exchange your gifts minute by minute, day by day, in caring for the houses and caring for the land and building small enterprises and doing daily tasks with each other and for each other, and in doing the art and playing the music. I want you to tell those stories, because in the telling of those stories, it's like, to use a biblical phrase, there's a passage in Hebrews somewhere, I don't remember where, but it basically says, when you see how it works out for your teachers, imitate their faith. Stories are not about me doing what you do. Stories are about me being inspired by you to be as powerful as you are. And that's where hope comes into the picture. Because if I'm inspired by your faith and by your action, I gain the capacity to be faithful and to act in the world myself. And that is a human trait. It's not personal. It's human. So I beg you, Camp Hill, tell your stories. The world needs to hear you. Thank you.
So our final speaker for the evening is Eugene Schwartz, and many of you, most of you know him already as a, I asked how to introduce you. I was told I could say you were an anthroposophist for 40 years and a Waldorf educator for 35. Did I get that correct? And travels now internationally talking and teaching about Waldorf education. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Now I know it's late, and I promise I won't go on more than 20 minutes, but I deeply appreciate everything that has transpired tonight and in these days. There is absolutely nothing that I can really add to the richness that we've been given Tuesday night, last night by the community, and tonight. And all of these remarkable speakers coming from so many directions. So I won't try to add anything. I hope I won't subtract anything, but I will just try to look at it from another perspective. And if not necessarily sum things up, at least perhaps look a little down on us tonight from another vantage point. First of all, I want to second what was said about the stories of Camp Hill. And we can't forget, among many others, 3 significant individuals who've made it possible for us to be here and for this community to be here. Alaric Marin, one of them. a wealthy man, a businessman, an oil man. So there we've got one of the stories of the 20th century, oil. Secondly, Ehrenfried Pfeiffer, the great progenitor of biodynamic agriculture, the engineer turned farmer, nutritionist, esotericist. So here we have work with the land, the impulse of farming, already living here when Pfeiffer worked. And then lastly, of course, but not least, Dr. Karl Koenig, the deep, probably initiate individual of the 20th century, the doctor, the archetype of the healer. What's left? Maybe a military man or two could have been involved as well. It pretty much covers the bases of all that's good and not so good about the 20th century. Petroleum, medicine, food, agriculture. It, in a certain way, really, we can feel these are the titans. These are the giants on whose shoulders we try to stand. Now, when Sigmund Freud was told by his student, Alfred Adler, that Adler was leaving, he wasn't going to work with Freud anymore, he was tired of his authoritarian nature, Freud said to him, as I understand Karl Koenig would say to individuals as well, you'll never find your way. You'll never be able to do it on your own. To which Adler said, if men stand on the shoulders of giants, they can see further than the giants. To which Freud replied, not if they are fleas. So this is perhaps a flea perspective, what you'll hear. Again and again in these days, we've been speaking about, to use your wonderful phrase, this kind of mess that we've gotten ourselves into. And it's interesting how here in the bucolic serenity of Kimberton Hills, every time the T word was mentioned, technology, it took over the discussion. You would think that everybody here worked for Silicon Valley in their spare time. It's amazing how compelling this is. Where does this come from? Is technology, in some way or another, its development, related perhaps to some of the deeper human issues that we are facing? Certainly we know it's affected food. Certainly we know it's affected the treatment of a host of illnesses or states of consciousness considered illnesses. Where does this come from? And as many of those speakers and guests visiting this community have asked, whence comes the inspiration for a community like this to go forward? Not just in the big picture, the vision, many share that, but in the day-to-day work, the difficult day-to-day work of forming a community. So I want to give you only two short pictures. They come from Rudolf Steiner, though I will try not to say Steiner says. Thank you very much, but that's the source. One of them is the picture of human life, the human biography. Now, I worked for a decade in another intentional community, as some of you know, the fellowship community, north of here in Chestnut Ridge, where I work with the aged and the dying for a decade. I was at the deathbed of 40 people. I was there as about 25 of them actually crossed the threshold at that moment. And there we did a lot of work, a lot of study about life after death. And from there, I found myself hurled a bit kicking and screaming, because I love the work with the aged and the dying, into Waldorf education, suddenly having to work with the diametrically opposite side of life, coming into birth, coming into vitality, incarnating, only to learn by another aspect of Steiner's work, more study, that these two are by no means opposites, that they are inextricably entwined. The only technical difference between them is a period of 1,000 years. So here we can go on to your lengthy, lengthy biography, Judith. About 1,000 years, Steiner says, it takes between the time an individual dies and a time that they come back into life in a completely new body, with a completely new personality, in a completely different kind of earth. This is very different from all other teachings about reincarnation, which are all about a much, much shorter period. In the Gurdjieff school, Gurdjieff would tell his students, you vibrate, and the vibrations immediately reassemble all of the molecules in your body, and you are born instantly into another body, or at least very, very quickly. Steiner's picture is a human life, be it 60, 70, 80 years, is so rich, so complex, so different from anything that goes on in the spiritual world that we need 1,000 years to process it. 500 years to look back on what we did, to think what we could have done better, and another 500 years to get ready for the next 60, 70, 80-year incarnation. We are moving so incredibly rapidly on the earth. Our life is indeed just a blink of an eye compared to these long periods in the spiritual world. And just a couple of thoughts about this incarnating period. As we come closer to the earth, we work with higher beings, hierarchical beings, as Steiner described them. The highest are beings who work on the very cosmic configuration of the earth, its relationship to the sun, to the moon, to the other planets. We are empowered to work with them and help make slight adjustments so we come to the earth that we need to come to. We go a little further down. We work with beings called spirits of form, and what do? They help to make the weather. They take the forces that we carried with us in our last incarnation, 1,000 years before, and those make the weather today. So the tornadoes, the tsunamis, the geological, meteorological changes have to do with the unborn bringing that to us so that the earth has the right conditions for our continuing incarnations, I could say our continuing education. We really make the weather. And we could say the phenomenon of global warming, part of it is what's going on now on the earth. Part of it is what went on in the Middle Ages, 1,000 years ago. And then we come closer to the earth, and now we, in a way, gather from spiritual beings the very tools that we will need for our education. That is, the unborn souls close to the earth now begin to inspire inventors, technologists, artists, and teachers to begin to bring new conditions into earthly life out of human activity. And this is the T word. This is where technology comes from. This is why my 5-year-old daughter, watching me early in the morning, I'd get up so early hoping she wouldn't be awake yet so I could work at the computer. She'd get up that much earlier the next day. She comes in, watches me, I'm struggling with something. She said, "That, Daddy, that one," and touches a key, and everything's cleared. It's fine. Computer's okay. Where did she learn that? She invented the machine that I was using. She was much closer to its genesis. She inspired Bill Gates. She inspired Stephen Jobs, along with her whole generation. They are not just kind of coming into a world, oh my God, look at those things attacking them. They put them there because they need that in order to take their next step forward and guide the rest of us with them. It's a very different picture that Steiner gives of what incarnation is about. It's not, as Studs Terkel wrote a long time ago, coming into a world I never made. It is a world whose details I worked upon, like a teacher preparing the classroom on Sunday for the new main lesson block to begin on Monday, like a director setting the stage so that when the actors come out of the wings, there will be no surprises. Everything will be in place for them to act out their parts. Okay, why would the spiritual world bother? Why would they work so hard to create this entire experience of 1,000 years again and again and again for human beings? Why are we giving so much rope, as it were, hopefully not to hang ourselves? It is because we are the grand experiment of the cosmos. It is our task to do something that none of the hierarchical beings, save one, have been able to do, which is to incarnate into the density of the mineral world. That the Earth as it is now is denser than any other planet has been that we know of in the cosmos at any time. And we are incarnating into that and trying to find our way in a world that's dark and dense and very, very hard. Now, there's an image, I said, except for one, and that's an image that some in this room don't even really have to look at. They know it's there. Others coming for the first time to this room find it upsetting, jangling in a certain way, out of key with everything else they experience here. And that's the image to your right, my left, the image of Christ on the cross. This image of a spiritual being who went all the way into the state of minerality and matter that human beings do, and the incredible agony and pain and brevity of life that brought. This was the only way that the spiritual world could get an inkling of what it is to be a human being, or to be becoming human, we can say, to be working with that minerality, that substantiality again and again and again. And some of the deepest mysteries of meeting that world come when we eat and digest food, and that's why our farmers are so important, and come when we are ill, when we need the help of a physician, of a caretaker, when we need someone else to help us along, to, as it were, carry that cross along with us so that we can experience this mineral world. We are, as it were, the great experiment, the great gamble of the spiritual world. So there's this beautiful rhythm. Every 1,000 years, you come back. Everyone in this room, in the normal course of things, was together 1,000 years ago, somewhere else on the earth in a very, very different way, and so on. Many stories about this. But to put it shortly, yes and no. Because one thing, and I will have to say here, Steiner says, early in the 20th century, he said at the turn of the next century, at the turn of the new millennium, that is to say now, there will be such a battle on the earth between good and evil, between right and wrong, that it will have ramifications for the entire remaining evolution of the earth. He said because of this, the natural balance of, let's say, 10 billion souls in the spiritual world and 100 million on the earth, because the population of the earth has generally been relatively less than it is now, that balance will be completely disturbed because souls will want to be on the earth. The heavens will empty out, and there will be relatively few in the spiritual world compared to the many on the earth. He said this will be a wonderful thing because there's going to be this intentionality to be incarnated. However, it will create a couple of problems. One of them is earthly substance. Will there be enough of it to give individuals the bodies that they need to, out of themselves, completely fulfill their karma? No. No, there will not be. It will create, in a way, tremendous disparities of the way in which individuals are able to incarnate. Incarnation will be more difficult for everybody because it's like if we all had to rush out of that door at the same time, there'd be a natural pushing and pulling and grasping. Some would help, others would try to just get through it first. We have a little of this on the earth, or a lot of it right now. Secondly, the normal rhythm of karma is what keeps things normal and rhythmic on the earth. If there are millions, hundreds of millions, perhaps even 1 or 2 billion souls on the earth for whom this is not their normal rhythm, they will feel estranged, alienated, even invisible in their lives. They will feel, I walk into a room and nobody even knows I'm there. You know, people kind of turn away from me. There will be this sense which will manifest particularly in so-called mental illness. And this can account for this riddle of the incredible explosion of mental illness throughout the 20th century, and particularly now. For a whole new range, one might say, of human needs will be there. And all of this, through the wonderful economy of the spiritual world, solving these issues that are created because everybody wants to be on the earth, solving those issues or working on them will in turn be the very reason that people have come, because that's where good and evil will be worked out. We need not look for dragons to slay and be disappointed when they don't show up. They're right in front of us. They're all around us. They're called social life. And this, in a certain way, is this overarching perspective that Steiner gives us. Why are we here, and why is it worth it? The whole spiritual world is watching and wondering, how can human beings pull themselves up out of that dark, dense minerality, and how can they pull a few others out with them? I just want to conclude. Sorry about this. Eurythmus may leave the room. I did not have pencil and paper at my immediate command when I wanted to just write down a few things by way of bidding you good night. This is dedicated to those giants that I spoke of earlier, Karl Koenig, Ehrenfried Pfeiffer, Alaric Marin, but to all of you, to Camp Hill and all of its friends. The masters sojourn upon the earth from time to time to test our measure against that ideal form they guard in spirit rest. Against such a form we must fall short, our fullness unattained. Yet slowly greenness turns to gold, slim shoots to ripened grain. Within the grain, the small seed grows. Within the seed, new life. Within the life, man's being glows, awakening, godlike. Thank you all. Good night.